I know that a lot of attention has been focused on climate adaptation finance, but this is not our only challenge. It's one important challenge because Mahmoud come up to the stage as we speak. Thank you for coming. It is an important aspect of finance because it's about providing the financial capacity and additional capacity to the global south that is not responsible for the climate change, but is the area, the space that is more vulnerable to climate change. In Glasgow, we promised 100 million for every year to be diverted as finance for climate adaptation in the global south. We haven't reached the goal. This year, we are estimating 1 trillion per year for the developing world just for adaptation. And it remains to be seen what will be agreed. But let me also say that it's not just adaptation. We have to have joint effort on adaptation and mitigation. And the financing gap is prevalent both in the developed and in the developed world. In the developed world, more or less, we have some fiscal space in the government, but this is not enough. We all know that most of the money in the world is in private hands, not just larger corporations. The money of the people that are saved in commercial banks are there. The big challenge is how we can mobilize this money into public-private partnerships in order to finance both the mitigation, the renewables, the circular economy investments, the nature-based solutions investments, the investments on mobility, the investments of digitalization, and all these investments that are needed for climate adaptation. And beyond this, we all know that the SDGs is not just SDG 13, it's 17 goals, 169 targets, a very holistic, integrated framework in a very systemic setting in its transposition into real projects. So the financing that we are looking for, the financing for development, the financing for implementing our global agenda of the SDGs is financing for all the SDGs while recognizing the synergies between the SDGs and the trade-offs between the SDGs in a very systemic approach. It's not easy, it's science-hectic, it's data-hectic, and it needs to involve all stakeholders in terms of co-designing the transition pathways. So I will open the floor to our very prestigious speakers, just by saying once again that we need to articulate, we need to detail our pathways towards sustainability, our pathways towards climate neutrality and climate resilience. And these need to be detailed mixtures, optimal mixtures of technologies, policies, and fiscal and financial instruments. And on that note, I would like to turn to our speakers and pose the question, what are the most difficult challenges with regards to financing, and what it is particularly challenging in the developed world? What is particularly challenging in the global south? And I will start with you, Maria. No.
I really thank you, Phoebe. Thank you for this invitation. As always, SDSN is one step ahead. It brings in, the best people, great discussions. And, I was very excited about this session because it looked at climate finance in spaces, in subnational spaces, regions and cities. And I think that if we have challenges in the overall global financial architecture for climate, in an uneven weight between finance for mitigation and finance for adaptation, this disconnect and this imbalance is even worse when you look at regions and cities in particular. We are, all aware that we have less than 6 years to meet the 1.5 degree Celsius target of the Paris Agreement, and we know we are all also aware of the urgency to increase ambition, to accelerate action, and this is why this COP is so important. It's called the Enabling COP, the Finance COP, and we all here know that we have high expectations on what is going to come out of the new climate finance goal, the NCQG. We would like to see money and a fully operational loss and damage fund. We would like to see a final agreement on Article 6.4 on carbon markets. We would like to see all of that. We would like to see a goal on adaptation. I think this is absolutely critical. And when you have these umbrellas, these global frameworks, that's what COPs are about. That is what the Climate Convention is about, is providing this overall universal policy guidance. But that need to be informed by cities and regions, and the other way around, need to inform policies and decisions that are taken at the local and sub-regional level. And here I would like to say a few words in my capacity as president of the Cities Alliance. We are extremely worried about what is happening in cities. We all know that 70% of the emissions come from urban spaces, that more than 60% of the SDGs, all the indicators you mentioned, Phoebe, have to be complied with and addressed in the urban space. And yet we see that 1 billion people live in slums, with women and children comprising between 35 to 50% of this population. And the UN is telling us that these 1 billion people living in slums will multiply by 2 in only 30 years. So we're worried about that. We're worried about extreme heat in cities. We are worried about the impact it has on women and girls. And we are also worried about the lack of agreement, and not only in the amounts, not only in the sources of the funding, but in the existing governance instruments to make sure that the money reaches the people in need. I think this conversation on climate finance, the new target, the money for loss and damage and all of that, should also be connected to a process that is ongoing. And I see that there is a lot of energy, which is the reform of international financial architecture. I'm glad to see Mahmoud here because he masters the issue, but we strongly believe that multilateral banks should have a key role to play, not only in financing countries and nations, but to have cities and regions access the resources in a sort of fast track, a low impact due diligence to make sure that the money reaches the people in need, the most vulnerable, the people in slums, speaking with the voice of the Cities Alliance. And this is not an easy fix, but I think, I really hope that at the end of this COP we will have something to show the world. This is a UN conference. There are 198 parties to this convention, and we have a great responsibility. I really hope that this, again, connects with the conversations of the reform of the international financial architecture, with the new taxing system and the new tax convention under the umbrella of the UN, the conversations on debt relief, which are critical again when we think about the overall climate finance architecture, the role of regional banks. I'm happy to see CAF here in the audience, the very increasing important role of regional banks, in the need at the end of the day to rethink climate finance from a people-centered, city-centered, regional and region-centered approach. If we have a second round, perhaps a few ideas on how to connect the expected outcomes of COP29 with the conversation about the reform of international financial architecture. I'm really a call from most of you in civil society to push for a strong outcome in this COP. I serve in the advisory committee of COP29, and I feel the responsibility also with all of you that we need to deliver, that the world is watching, and we really need to step up ambition, to commit and to act. Thank you.
To commit and to act. Indeed, we have the person who is the special envoy to the UN on financing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, Professor Mahmoud Mohiuddin, a person who has done a lot of work, both academic, but also a lot of work in the multilateral space, also with the World Bank, the IMF, on financing for development. Not just the Global South, but financing for development. Mahmoud, I always say in my speeches that unless we restructure the global financial architecture that Maria referred to, we are not going to have the Global South on board, or not just the Global South. Also, countries with very limited fiscal space. At the moment, we have 1/3 of the countries at the brink of default. Fiscal spaces are shrinking all over the world. It is indeed a very complicated situation with regards to the economics, because growth rates are low, inflationary pressures are there, and fiscal spaces are shrinking. So it becomes obvious that public-private partnerships are going to be needed, and a restructure of the global financial architecture towards enabling financing, like Maria said, to those most in need, because everybody is in need, almost everybody is in need, most in need, is important, with real SDG stimulus loans, long-run loans, and low-interest loans. How are we going to do that, given the risks in the Global South? The floor is yours.
Right. Thank you so much, and many thanks for your introductory remarks and an excellent intervention by Maria. Good thing is that a full answer from practical perspective and political emphasis should be shared with us in a few months in Spain, and the road to Spain in Seville. But let me just highlight what is the path toward that, and what we learned since Addis, and how we're linking the work on climate finance and what we should be expecting from here in Baku, and the work that we should be hearing more in Brazil in a few days, actions related to reforms of the APBs, and the work that we should be expecting more from our brothers in South Africa dealing with the silent crisis, which is the debt crisis. So when it comes to climate finance, and I would say development finance, because I think we spent a lot of time, especially from the countries of the Global South, to demonstrate that climate action is development action. And anything that can go in the right direction for climate, it will help, definitely. we talk about mitigation, SDG 7, talk about adaptation, food, water systems between SDG 6 and SDG 2. We need to do all of that while we need really to minimize the problems and implications on inequality and poverty, SDG 10 and 1. But some of us tend to forget that, and it's really puzzling because practically, especially for people living in cities or rural communities or localities, they don't really mind where the help is going to be coming from. Is it going to come from the Green Climate Fund, or is it going to come from the World Bank or the African Development Bank? At the end, money is fungible and it's going to go into projects that need to be enhancing our climate resilience and our support to sustainable development. And it is not really an issue of trade-off. Okay? So, for climate finance and development finance, we suffer from the three problems that cannot be fixed until we fix the architecture. Otherwise, we'll always be talking about partial solutions. Insufficiency, inefficiency, and unfairness. This is the story. And this is the debate that's happening next door with our leadership. And independent assessors, including top academics like Nick Stern, good work by Jeff Sachs, have been really demonstrating the gaps at global level, country level, and there are many reports, many of them came yesterday and today, updating us on our knowledge. That assuming that China can take care of herself, assuming that advanced economies are advanced enough that we can mobilize resources. So I left with the developing economies and emerging markets of the global south. They would require $1 trillion of external finance to support $1.4 trillion that should be mobilized at home. So there is nobody who's saying that we're relying on gifts and charities. It's investment to support mobilization of resources at home. And the heavy lifting will be coming from each country's village, rural community, and its own citizens, including the poorest of the poor countries of the world, because they are doing already a great deal of support when it comes especially to financing adaptation, which is 98% funded by public sources, 2% only from private sources, and all of that, unfortunately, have been heavily dependent on debt instruments, not necessarily concession. So here is the insufficiency and the unfairness at the same time. That somebody's building a mansion or a palace somewhere, and I'm his neighbor or her neighbor, and I'm asking, they're asking me to fix the problems of spillovers by borrowing at a very expensive cost in the markets. This is how it works now, just to simplify it. So we see the insufficiency and the unfairness because of indebtedness, because of trying to fix the resilience issues. And then the issue of efficiency. The money doesn't come really fast enough. And actually, the World Bank president was brave enough when he was in Marrakesh when he said it takes 27 months for the dollar to come out or to get out from the door for development and climate. That was a year ago, but I know that my former colleagues at the World Bank are working hard. But it is definitely not 27 weeks. It is still in months, not in weeks. And here we need really to get this kind of acceleration of funding, and we need to have that kind of an approach balanced. How to fix it? Finance for development, just for those who didn't read the lengthy reports, or even the draft that is preparing us for Sabine. Nothing should be surprising in terms of the skeleton that we inherited from the old days, from Monterey to Doha to Addis. Public-private finance, external and domestic finance, those are 4 chapters. Then you have debt management, you have trade, you have STI, science, technology, and innovation, and you have the data system to support all of that. So it looks here that the enablers need to speak to each other. You cannot just do finance without good support on data, statistics, guiding the policymakers, and you not just government policymakers, but decision makers and private sector, NGOs and CSOs and philanthropies. So here we need to start with data, and I'd like to refer to this important thing because our good colleague, Claire Merriman, had articulated the needs in investment in data and research to support good work by data. For every dollar that you spend, you are gaining $32. This is demonstrated by work, but we're not investing enough in data systems. Anyway, this is the finance for development. What will be added? I think, given the kind of dynamic that we see in the geopolitics, and I want everybody's talking about that, but we take that as given. It's people's choice. But that has implications. And again, some advanced economies in Europe and the United States, I'm not worried about them because they have the resilience of the economy. And I was in a meeting with a couple of state leaders from Maryland and the state of Washington. The system had the flexibility and had the generosity of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, to support great transformation in climate, in greening, in digitalization. And I think the IRA, as I was betting for many months, is going to continue in the US.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Yeah, especially that almost 70% of the beneficiaries are from Republican states. And the Democratic ones are catching up and they are doing more. So it's a nice competition to see. And I see, as well as it happened before, communities, corporate leaders, they have the antibodies as well, because there is a business case now to climate. It's not just about preaching. There is a business case, especially in the greening of the economy, decarbonization, solar, and all that. We see EVs, we see solar talks and all that. I'm more worried about adaptation for the rest of us in Africa, for instance, because for every dollar that is coming, based on the old indices, not sophisticated enough, there is $5 needed. And based on the independent assessment by UNEP, we need 10. So $11 billion of flows to the continent last year for adaptation. We're missing 55 billion minus 11. We're missing 110 minus 11. So we can just see how much is the gap. And actually, I got more worried when I read this report about the gaps, because it tells you that 200 billion to 400 billion are the gaps of finance for climate. In itself, it's a disaster, because if I'm telling you, as a top economist and researcher, I got these results, but I'm not quite sure if they are accurate. You will not tolerate more than 1%. You may not tolerate in a good day more than 3%. But I will tell you, when I got these results, but you could be 100 to 200% wrong. You will not get received. But this is basically, even the best of us in these systems are victims of the fact that we don't get adequate information from rural areas, from villages, from cities, and there is no bottom-up approach. So more work is needed than that. So I come here to the final. If we're assuming that every problem under the sun will be solved by external source and by fixing the World Bank and the IMF and reforming them, well, definitely. Even the leadership of these institutions and the major shareholders, they say, well, they need to be more inclusive, they need to be with more capital, we need to have our weights on the global south reflected in the governance. I was on the board of the IMF for 4 years, and I know that the constituency I'm representing is underrepresented if we have a fair quota review. Mind you, back in 1944, many of the countries today, of the 191 of membership of these IFIs, were not even with sovereignty and legitimacy to vote. Now it's a completely different world. We're not in 1944. We're not even in 2015 when we were discussing various agenda. So it's here the challenge is not the issue of a challenge for these institutions. I'm very proud of every hour, of just every day I spend there, because they have some of the most sophisticated technicians and experts who know what really to do if you want to fix education system, health, build a bridge somewhere, do de-risking, but they are short in capital. There is no alternative to revising the governance of these institutions, revive the shareholders' agreement, and have a reflection of the voice with the adequacy and inclusiveness of the board and the membership at large. Here we can regain the trust and make sure that these institutions are fit for the purpose for the next 80 years. Because we are celebrating today for good reasons the establishment of 80 years. What's stopping that is not technical solutions. It's not lacking a genius somewhere within these institutions or beyond telling you how these formulas should be fixed. We know how the formula should be fixed. It's geopolitics again. Some of the old incumbent players are sticking to their musical chairs. That needs to be revised and challenged, because we need to tell them that some of these countries of the incumbents are with overweight, which is corresponding to the underweight of some of the emerging markets and developing economies. And we cannot really just live by some sort of consideration from some time to time, like adding a chair for another chair or additional chair to Africa. Well, that's great news, but this is not adequate enough, inclusive enough. Meanwhile, until that kind of ground design of things will happen, and there was sometimes we are charitable to call it a system or an architecture, because we inherit these great world of architectural systems from the old designs. But they are short of being called systems. Arrangements of the old days, post-war kind of arrangements. People are not stopping, and that's why I'm seeing more regionalized solutions and more localized solutions. I'm in fear, and there is a very good piece by our common friend, Professor Danny Roderick. You see his piece today in the Project Syndicate about the rise of the middle powers and smaller countries becoming bigger in terms of economy and impact. And that could polarize the systems more and cause more fragmentation in the global system. I like to have more regional cooperation. I'm pro the African trade arrangement. I'm pro the Arab arrangements. I'm admiring every day of progress in the ASEAN countries of what they do for themselves, competing with European models for good reasons, for trade, investment, technology transfer, and application. But I'm very much concerned if these kind of regional arrangements are happening to decouple further and deglobalize further and to polarize the system further. We can really do better by following good standards, being more pragmatic until that global system gets its sense back. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mahmoud. Thank you. But you know, Mahmoud, there has to be a way to nourish all these benefits that are to be made by climate resilience, by climate adaptation. The benefits are huge. If you get into the exercise of calculating, monetizing those benefits are huge. The investments that are needed are also huge. So if you get some stability, some geopolitical stability at the global level at least, and attract the private sector with some facilitation of infrastructural investments from the public sector and the multilateral institution, it could happen, right?
Well, there is.
Sorry but I need your answer very quickly.
Yeah, I bet other colleagues in the panel have better answers than mine, but actually, based on the evidence, we are realizing obviously the benefit of behavioral change through regulation, investments in new technologies. Every time I called someone who said that we are better with better technologies, reducing the cost of producing electricity from solar by 90%. That was a few weeks ago. He said no, it's more than 98% now. Thanks to technology, innovation, R&D, and production at scale in China. This is the magic that happened. Invention in the United States, innovation in Europe, adaptation to new technologies in countries like mine, Egypt, or Morocco, and Mozambique, or in the solar villages there. Any kind of drop in this equation will compromise the benefit that you mentioned. So yes, definitely, the benefits are there. And mind you, these are basically benefits that could happen by just facilitation by the public and getting the wonderful work by philanthropies and the private sector and local communities to support the work. The case is less so in adaptation, because adaptation is more on the social gains. But actually, in the past, people saw that adaptation finance is very much localized. It was not localized, because if there is a damage in one village, there is some internal displacement that will cross the border, and as we have seen, many people have been impacted by these disasters from Pakistan to Africa. Many of them ended to be in Europe or other places, and they are not necessarily happy, because people, when they are forced to be migrants, it's not by choice. So it's not just the hosts who are not happy to receive the floods of the migrants. Some of the migrants we lose as countries exporting talents. We lose some of our fittest in physical fitness and, more importantly, in brains and skills and aspiration to do that. So I think, yes, there is a great case to establish this kind of common sense approach of collaboration, but unfortunately, common sense doesn't always prevail when there is a touch of politics.
Common sense is not so common, true. We also have with us the CEO of a new bank, a new development bank on resilience and prosperity. So it is exactly this kind of focus that we've been talking about just now. And please, Jim, let us know. So, Dr. Jim Leon, Please, Jim, tell us how you see the bank changing.
Thank you very much, Phoebe, and let me acknowledge my colleagues on stage. Professor Mahmood, I cannot agree with you more in terms of what you have described. There is, I think, three fundamental issues in the world today. Global inequities, broadly defined. One, ecological degradation, broadly defined. And third, what I want to call unfulfilled multilateralism. And that unfulfilled multilateralism is what you refer to when we say the architecture. And I think that architecture needs three elements to be refined. Like you spent 4 years at the board, I spent 25 years at the IMF. So I think I understand your language very well. One, there's need for a change in governance of those institutions, as you have mentioned. There is equally a change to expand the access and source of financing. That's also being talked about, but is being mentioned in the sense of capital accumulation. And the third element that is missing is partnerships. We need to redefine what that means if the multilateral system is to actually be able to work. So having said that, I want to zero in on the points that I want to make from the perspective of a development bank for resilient prosperity that was just launched in May, end of May of this year at the 4th Small Island Developing States Conference in Antigua Barbuda. And the idea here really is the global architecture that was in principle allowed to chaperone the visions of one, the Barbados Accord, or the Mauritius Strategy, or the Samoa Pathway have not really lived up to the expectations. So that inequality that you refer to is because we do not have an institution that can focus dedicatedly on the problems, unique problems that those countries face. And although I'm going to talk about small island developing states, it applies equally to the landlocked, less developed countries and the low-lying coastal states. Now, if you put yourself in that sense of one, what's the context? The first part we have is that the financing needs are just not there. You talked of finance for development and climate being a part of that. If you just take climate is at best, we are seeing 5% in adaptation, for example. Inadequate amounts in terms of quantum for the climate needs, let alone the development needs that you have. The ravages of climate change continue to mount. And when you put all of this together, I think it comes to one basic point. We are leaving behind a large chunk of the world, which I'm calling the underserved. And so one of the objectives of the institution that we're looking at now are to do two things. One is to fill the gaps and therefore complement the inadequacies of the global financial architecture. And second is we want to do that in a way that does not amplify the debt situation that the countries already have. So from that basic perspective, I want to talk of 4 potential areas that I see we can actually contribute. The first is in the concept of quantum. We obviously do not have enough access to financing that is non-debt creating. And one way of doing this is, I think, to remap and reimagine what is the planet. The planet, if you think of it as being a sustainable system, has a very large part of its productive capacity that is simply not part of the system today. We are focused on economic capacity, but then there is human capacity, there's institutional strength, there's ecological sustainability, and there's also the social cohesion that are elements of what will influence the productive capacity of the planet. And because we have focused only on the economic capacity, we have used an under measure of total cost. So the costs to the climate, the costs to the planet, whether it's in terms of biodiversity loss, in terms of ocean acidification, in terms of the carbonization of the atmosphere, poor land use, all of those things have simply not been costed. And because it has not been costed appropriately, the return on activities in the economic sphere is actually elevated. And because it is elevated, the incentives to continue and therefore lead to overexploitation continue, and consequently what we are left with is the outcome we have today. So we want to remap this by saying, let's talk about productive capacity as opposed to economic activity. Let us make the cost, the total cost function, and when you do that, you are left with the inescapable fact that we need to put value to all of nature. And so a large part of what we are doing is talking of how do we monetize through tokenization the natural assets that all countries have. And the moment you do this, you change the landscape immediately from poor land-only asset countries to richer natural asset countries, including the expanse of the ocean, the biodiversity of the states, and how you can actually monetize that. So that's a large part. We increase the income generation aspect. When you increase the income generation, that takes care of the quantum, because it means how you are not debt creating, and you have more income available to drive development that can be targeted. The second element is the issue of instruments. What types of instruments can we think about that are different? I can think of three things that need to happen to the global system. The first is, let's change the definition of reserve assets. Reserve assets, as we know it, are reserve currencies that are owned and controlled by a few countries. Now that limits the ability of countries' wealth in terms of reserve assets. So let us change callable assets and make them part of reserve assets. Let us include natural assets as reserve assets, suitably valued. And let us now look to moving pledged assets into the zone, almost like callable assets of reserve assets. So your 100 billion pledge that we have been talking about for climate change, if we were to put those in as reserve assets of countries, that automatically changes the bottom line and puts the pressure on those countries that if it is called, they have to make it. So a pledge becomes not just a pledge, but a real asset on the books of countries. And even if it's not called, it can be used by credit rating agencies as a means of saying there is support. And if there is support, your credit rating and your ability to access finance can change. So that's one strong.
We have to wrap it together.
Okay, so that's one on the instrument side. On costs, I've talked about changing the measure of total cost. I think if we do that, we change the incentive structure. But I think we also need to look at the support mechanisms. You cannot undertake finance and change the way the world goes if you don't touch on capacity building. And so whether it is in the pre-appraisal stage, in a monetary mechanism, and in building capacity to implement, these have to be all wrapped into whatever it is that you are doing. And the sources, I think blended finance is the way to go. And what we are pushing is a much greater role for private sector financing from family offices, philanthropies, and of course we talked about the use of these natural assets on private markets. If you put all those together, you have a means of addressing not only the quantum, but the cost and the means to actually deliver it, and therefore give it a chance to make a difference for those countries in the next development.
Excellent. And afterwards, Poonam Konark from my team will be talking a bit about the valuation of these assets and what we have actually achieved in that space. Let me move to our next speaker. Sean Fitzgerald is the Director of Climate Repair at Cambridge University, and I want your view on our difficulties and challenges.
So I'm at the University of Cambridge, so it won't surprise you, I hope, that actually my area of focus is actually research and education. So we heard from Maria, and indeed Mahmood, about the issue being that we shouldn't just be talking about climate finance and development finance. We heard the numbers, $1 billion in slums, soon to be $2 billion. And I hope we recognise that what that really means isn't just being basically on the front line of the effects of climate change, but everything else about actually what it means to be actually really stimulated and fulfilled and developed. And education is actually part of this. So, you give a person a fish, or you give them a fishing rod, right? This is what it's all about. So there is a role in this whole agenda for actually how we think about the linkage between climate finance and development finance, and actually how we then go and share our resources. And I'm talking from the University of Cambridge, I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of many, many academics. This is about actually how we go and inspire. So education is not just about teaching people things, but actually teaching people to be inspired. And we have research and education at Cambridge. And we feel really strongly about the role of research. And it isn't just because they have the outputs of research, which I'll come to in just a moment, but it's about the development of inquisitive and curious minds to go and find solutions to tackle adaptation, to tackle mitigation from within the countries that are also on the front line of climate change. So there is a significant role for development finance on the education side as part of our tackling the effects of climate change and changing and getting into the energy transition piece. Now, as Director of the Centre for Climate Repair, we are interested in 3 R's. One is clearly tackling emissions, so emissions reduction. But we also have 2 big programs, one on greenhouse gas removal, and there is a massive, massive role in greenhouse gas removal within the developing world. And if we now think about the developments that we are hoping to get even more in this COP on Article 6, Article 6.4, and therefore carbon markets, and what does that actually feature feature greenhouse gas removal in here, there is a significant opportunity to bring to the main stage the developing world in some of the technologies and approaches that have already been established, but there are more to be established as well using research. And our third R is actually looking at the options, because you've heard about the crises in 2024. This is, as we've heard, is a masterclass in basically disasters of climate change, and everything that we are talking about in the negotiating rooms today and over the last few COPs has been on emissions reduction and greenhouse gas removal. We're going too slowly, and it's very, very unlikely that we're going to be able to tackle climate change in a meaningful way. And therefore, one of the areas that we're very keen to see development money going into for education and research across the world are some of the other things that we can consider in the form of climate engineering. We don't have the answers, and we need to be more informed so we can make more informed decisions as to whether some of these measures might be able to enable us to withstand the effects of climate change whilst we get greenhouse gas levels down. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. We don't have the answers, but we have a lot of the answers, a lot of the technology, and we need to mobilize that towards implementation in order to achieve impact. Very quickly, I lead the Alliance of Excellence for Research and Innovation of IFORIA, bringing together research and innovation centers, innovation accelerator hubs, science policy networks, and scientific associations and academy that I lead or co-lead or direct. And within this space, we are working a lot on the main design of pathways. So what we are doing is that we are quantifying where we are with regards to the SDGs, with regards to climate change, for example, and we are developing pathways, the optimal mixture of technologies, policies, fiscal and financial instruments in order to achieve our targets. Our targets are the SDGs that have been transposed across the world into detailed policy frameworks. And we try to do this with different thematic priorities: science, sustainable finance, climate neutrality and resilience, sustainable blue economy, land use and water, food, energy nexus, sustainable pathways, innovation acceleration, and of course increasing the capacity for implementation, which means education, upskilling, and reskilling. Within this framework, we lead the SDSL Global Climate Hub and chairing this 100 researchers are working on this. In Aiforia, we have more than 200 researchers working in 120 countries and more than many projects, more than 100 projects going on simultaneously across the globe. The Global Climate Hub has exactly what all the panelists have referred to: integrated, holistic, systemic structure. It's about all the SDGs. You cannot solve the climate by thinking only about SDG 13. And it has the first layer, which is interdisciplinary mathematical modeling, integrating climate scenarios, energy and transport systems transformation, land use and marine systems transformation, health systems, innovation systems, and then integrating everything into socioeconomic systems to answer the question, who is going to finance, how we care for the vulnerable, and while doing the scientific interdisciplinary pathways, we are at each step consulting our stakeholders. And about the stakeholders, Epun will talk about that, but let me add that we have a digital platform collecting all the data, all the models, all the outputs, and providing capacity to use all of this through training, through decision support tools, through visualization tools. Epun?
Thank you very much, Vivi. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call hacking research and innovation funding. Some of you may ask what the role of research institutions might play in the climate space. So the first thing you would think about is obviously as hubs of knowledge, providing innovation, providing technological solutions, etc. Or even, zero emission campuses within their own infrastructural space trying to reduce emissions and play their role in fighting climate change. But then taking it a step further, we ask, what role can they actually play in channeling finance to cities and regions that need this funding to support their climate actions? So we hack the system. And basically, the key word there is synergy. We take the climate adaptation and mitigation policies, so whether that's the SDGs, whether those are national policies, and look at the key priorities there, and map them onto the actual needs and the priorities of these cities and regions at a downscale level. And we tie them to the research and innovation objectives that are currently being funded. So what funding comes out, how do they tackle the policy, and how do they meet the needs? And bringing these three together, we're able to then channel research and innovation funding to support climate action on the ground within cities and regions. So we have a two-tier approach. So the first level, the first layer, is about getting the projects themselves funded. And within the context of those projects, we take the research and innovation funds, we work with the different cities, regions, and the output of that are these innovation pathways that we refer to, and we mean not just technological innovations, but social, financial, policy innovations, and action plans, which detail the strategic priorities and the roadmaps for these different cities and regions. And now we need to get those plans funded, and we need to fund the actions along those pathways. And based on that, we can then leverage other sources of funding. So Mahmoud made reference earlier to the fact that all of those funds can't come from most of it can't come from governments. But what we're then able to do is, since there's a business case for climate change now, we're able to attract private sector funding as well as public funds, multilateral funds, structural funds, to actually support specific innovation actions along these pathways. And that funding goes to support the climate change innovations themselves that are coming out of the projects. So a big part of that is about stakeholder co-creation. So there was mention earlier about having these bottom-up approaches. And we integrate the bottom-up strategies that are coming from cities and regions close to the ground within a systemic approach, as outlined earlier by Phoebe, where we can really work with the stakeholders to downscale some of those strategies and policies and tie them closely to the local needs. We take the model outputs and the scientific outputs from from all the downscale data and are able to then create these pathways, innovation paths, structural, social, financial, technological, plus policy innovation pathways. We're able to identify the actions, but even more importantly, we're able to identify the gaps. So we can see where the capacity needs to be developed. So going back to what you were saying earlier, we can then plug those gaps by creating capacity development programs and engaging specific stakeholders who are responsible for the implementation of these strategies. So we're able to, first of all, give them the playbook so they can play their position, but also teach them and support them with capacity and skills to carry that out. And then finally, we anchor all of this in innovation acceleration. So we made mention earlier of all the different innovations that are coming out of those pathways. So on the one hand, we have existing innovations. So we tap into the existing innovations, but we also highlight those innovation gaps so that the startups, the innovators, the entrepreneurs that we're speaking to can already start thinking about where their efforts are most needed and plug specifically into those gaps. And we support those that are doing that through several accelerators that we have running within the hub. So we have the Climate Innovation Unit that's specific to climate change, the Maritime Accelerator that's looking at green ports in the MENA region, and most recently the Black Sea Accelerator that's specifically focused on blue economy. And I think I'll stop at this point, and I'll take it from
Yes,
there.
and within these accelerators, we have more than 500 spin-offs and startups. 1 minute, Connor,
Sorry,
please.
I'll just jump in with one
Yes.
final slide. So just a cross-section of some of our most recent projects in the last 2 funding cycles.